Welcome to Trending Faith here on GCU TV. My name is Ashley Romantic, and let's get started with today's question. God clearly has a plan and purpose for everyone's life. Can we sabotage God's plans? What do you think, Tim?
Even the question kind of assumes some things that I don't know that that I believe, which is that it's clear that God has a specific plan for somebody's life. So I don't know if that's true, personally. I think that God has an incredible ability, if you would, to weave together our lives and the experiences of our lives into accomplishing His purposes in the world. And so I don't know that God sits in heaven and sees us living out our life and goes, oh, He just screwed everything up, as if He's taken by that. I think that God has the ability to weave together what happens in our lives and decisions that we make to bring about His ultimate good, even though it sometimes may appear to us to be a circuitous route to get to a certain destination. And the reason I kind of come from this is, I'm projecting a little bit here because my own personal experiences around this idea of knowing God's will and purposes and plans that He might have for, His children may not be as clear as we sometimes think and assume. And I think we gather that from what we either observe in Scripture when we read how God kind of created a path or a plan for somebody's life, and we assume certain details about it as if it was to be exactly the way it played out in that particular situation. And I think sometimes that we don't understand it from like Paul's perspective or Moses' perspective and how it unfolded in their own human experience. And I don't know that it was clear for them all the time. And so I think we go into the Christian life like God's going to send us a roadmap and a life plan, and we're going to follow steps A, B, and C, and our life is going to unfold perfectly if we just look for the roadmap, and He's going to offer it to us in prayer or some great revelation. Because I remember when I was a believer and a new believer, and I would hear people give testimony to what they were going to do with the rest of their life, that God had called them to be a pastor, God had called them to be a missionary or a doctor or a teacher. And I remember in my early Christian life going, well, it seems like the way they're saying it, it's like a phone call almost, that they hear God's voice and He tells them, you're going to do this. And I remember sitting there going, it's not that clear for me. And I struggled with that because I heard other people give testimony to the way that they heard God's voice. And it's like, all right, well, it's not happened for me like that, so maybe God's not calling me. Maybe I can't understand His clear purpose and plan for my life, even though I was begging Him for it. So I kind of came to this place in my life where I said, you know what? If God opens the door, I'm just going to walk through it. If He shuts the door, then obviously I'm not going to get through that and go that direction. And I think it's obvious to me that God has guided my steps along the way, even when I made foolish decisions, even when I made good decisions, that God had a way of weaving that together. So it kind of comes from a book that I read early on in my Christian life that just really shaped a lot of my thinking, called Decision Making in the Will of God, written by Gary Friesen out of Multnomah School of the Bible. And it was just a foundational book for my understanding on how God's will plays out. And one of the things that he proposes in the book is that there's a missing dot. In other words, we're always looking for the perfect plan and will of God. That there's the moral will, but there is no perfect plan for each individual believer. That there's a moral will that is reflected in the Scripture, that we're to live with integrity and kindness and love, and to kind of be on mission as it's described in Scripture. But there's many ways of fleshing that out in our own individual lives. So I did it as a pastor. I did it in a consulting setting. I did it as a chaplain. I'm doing it now in higher education. And so all of those were never, in my view, a place where I heard God's voice, go do this. It's just that I made decisions and God kind of guided the steps of my life to be in these vocational settings that gave me unique opportunities to be kind, to be patient, to be loving, and I was responsible in all those settings to be that way, which I think is what God's plan and will is for my life and for our lives as believers. So we're always looking for the exact specific vocational path to take, and where I think we're assuming that God's going to tell us, go do this, and therefore all this stuff will line up for you. I just don't think that's the way He plays out in our lives. And I think for most Christians, they sit there and they're anxious because they're afraid to miss the perfect will of God. And I think a lot of Christians are just anxious for the wrong things. And this perfect plan idea, this perfect will of God, I think is found in just being obedient to Him wherever we find ourselves, in any vocational setting. And it's harder in many ways to do that than it is to say, I heard God's voice, I got to go do this, and I go do that. And it seems very black and white. And I think much of life is way more gray than that. So I don't know. I have a little bit of a non-traditional view of this whole idea of plan and calling and God's will than I think most Christians either believe or what they've heard and try to follow. So I don't know. Jason, fix it. Fix what I just said.
Well, I think what I sense is that real tension that people feel between knowing that God has an overarching plan and maybe even a personalized plan for me, and this sense that I have to find my way in this life, and it requires more than just quoting a Bible verse at a particular point. I actually have to act in wisdom. So which car to buy, which spouse to marry, what home to live in, which job, those things aren't written. You can't quote chapter and verse for those things. It requires some thought, some application of biblical principles. And then that question, what if I mess it up? Doesn't God have this very straight and narrow plan? I think it's what theologians would refer to as sort of a tension between God's sovereign will, His sovereign plan, and His revealed will or revealed plan. So there are two going on at the same time. So sovereignly, God, has in mind what He would have throughout history. He brings nations into existence, entire empires. He's working at a personal level, all things for the good of those who love Him. Absolutely, but then there's also this sense in which He's revealed very, very clearly principles that ought to guide our lives. And so between those things going on, sometimes we freak out over this sovereign plan. Deuteronomy 29:29 is very helpful here, and this is Moses speaking to the people of Israel. He says, look, the secret things belong to the Lord, but the things revealed belong to us, that we may follow all the words of the Lord forever. That's a rough quote, but the gist of it is, look, there is this sovereign plan. Don't get caught up in that. God revealed to us what He would have for us, and that's where our responsibility lies. Is there something that He's bringing out that's part of His kingly responsibility? Yeah, well, He's the king. Let Him work through those things. You need to respond with wisdom at every point throughout your lives. And to be paralyzed by that tension, it can be overwhelming. If you think about the life of Christ, you realize that Christ was throughout His life moving toward the cross. That was part of God's sovereign plan. They didn't crucify Him, and the Father looks down on the Son and thinks to himself, oh my gosh, what do I do now? They've killed the Messiah. I didn't see that coming. Mm-hmm. Well, of course not. He knew that was coming. But you see Jesus responding with wisdom throughout His life, even to the point where He comes into the garden and He's having that conversation with His Father, and He's saying, look, this is intense. I feel overwhelmed. There's this grief. There's sense of foreboding. I know something is coming, but not my will be done. Yours be done. He's trying to align His life to what the Father would have. And I think we have to be in the same place. When we get ready to buy a car, do we buy the brand new BMW? Do we buy the old Toyota? Well, which allows us to be more generous with our possessions? Which spouse? Do we look for a godly wife, a godly husband, or do we look for somebody who's out to lunch spiritually, has no concern for the Lord? Well, these things are fairly straightforward in Scripture. What's her name? What's his name? Which particular model? Those are a little more difficult. But I think you're right. We get paralyzed by focusing on what God is up to when He's given us very clearly what we should be up to. And it can be overwhelming.
Yeah, I think you really hit on the key ingredient, which is pursuing wisdom. I think sometimes we to get to wisdom takes a lot of trial and error and mistakes along the way, and you gain wisdom through experience and life, and God can give it to us as well. But I think that is a key component of how to figure out how to live this life for Him. So I'm glad you added that. That was good.
Well, I hope that answers your question. And as always, if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to contact us at trendingfaith@gcu.edu or use the hashtag trendingfaith.